Hello, I'm Anne-Marie Wilson and this is Lesley Dougan. And welcome to this discussion on the importance and the relevance of pre-therapy and contact work. A special thank you to Peter Blundell from PCPC for inviting us to share our reflections on this aspect of the person-centred approach. Just take through kind of how we're structuring this. We're going to begin by introducing ourselves, a bit about our background, and our interest in the field before sharing some reflections on the chapter in the third edition of the Tribes of the Person-Centred Approach, written by Dion van Werd and with Pete Sanders' input from before on the pre-therapy and contact work. And this isn't a chapter review, but that's kind of feels like a platform or an opportunity for us to share our thoughts and reflections. And then also to add on to that in terms of the work that we've been doing around pre-therapy, the ideas we have, the questions that have come up as a result of the work that we've been doing. And just to put it out there and invite people to, question, wonder with us about this part of the approach. So maybe start with yourself, Lesley, say a bit about yourself.
Okay, so hi, my name's Lesley Dougan and I'm a neurodivergent person-centred experiential therapist. I qualified in 2012. So my background is I started working in child and adolescent mental health back in 1996 and predominantly working with children and young people with learning disabilities and neurodevelopmental conditions and their families, and that expanded out. And while I was in working with CAMS, I got some additional qualifications in autism, special educational needs, psychology, and then my counselling and psychotherapy qualification, which I got in 2012. So since then, I've had a variety of different roles, both within the NHS and in private practice. And I currently have a very small private practice where I work mostly with people who are neurodivergent. And I supervise a small number of supervisees who are mostly all neurodivergent too. So alongside my private practice, I am currently programme lead for the Masters in Counselling and Psychotherapy at Liverpool John Moores University. And when I started in that role, one of the key bits I thought was really important was to introduce students to pre-therapy and the concept of contact work. Yeah, that's me.
So I'm Anne-Marie. So I qualified as a person-centred and experiential psychotherapist in 2022 at John Moores and completed my MA dissertation last year, 2023. And I was focusing on the attitudes of students on the course towards using pre-therapy and contact reflections. Because my background is health and social care. So I worked kind of still do, for over 25 years with people with learning disabilities in a variety of support, management, leadership roles. And in that time, I was really aware of how poorly mental health was understood, was provided and supported for people with learning disabilities. And over time, there was some support, but largely the argument was that because of their disability, their learning disability, and in some cases, their inability to communicate verbally, that they wouldn't be able to access talk and therapy, wouldn't be able to access therapy at all. And over time, I became aware of some of the more creative arts that are available. So music, art, dance and movement. So there's a lot more of that. But I was just really aware that there didn't seem to be a lot out there. And in most cases, people would end up just on medication, or we were just told to manage. And then when I started on the course, and Lesley had done the lecture on pre-therapy, it was like a bit of a light bulb moment going, oh, so there is something out there. But also realizing that a lot of it was some of the interactions and relationship stuff was stuff I was doing in my role as a support worker. So it was kind of there, kind of instinctively, I guess, or learned just through learning from the people with learning disabilities themselves. But just that actually there were different ways of working with people, both in the care setting, but also that there was ways of supporting people. And yeah, out of that experience in the first year, I decided that would be part of my theme for my research. And out of that came a lot of questions, which is why myself and Lesley are regularly in contact and talking about what do we do now with all of this. So yeah, that's kind of a bit about us both. So I think we're going to start by just sharing some initial reflections and thoughts around the chapter. Like I said, it's not a chapter review, but just it felt really important that this chapter was out there. And then some of the themes that have come up from us from reading that, as well as the work that we've been doing, and just generally our thoughts around working with these client groups. So specifically thinking more learning disability and those who are neurodivergent. So yeah, so I don't know, Lesley, if you want to sort of kick off with some of your initial thoughts.
Yeah, I think one of the things that came to me about the new chapter, and it's an expanded chapter, so this is the third edition of the Tribes of the Person-Centered Nation that has come out. So the first one came out at the very beginning of the 2000s. And then there was a second edition in 2012. And then there was a small chapter by Pete Sanders in that. And it was put under the concept of the new developments. And what struck me was it wasn't a new development, because Gary Prouty, who sort of formulated the ideas of pre-therapy, had been working on it for decades. But nonetheless, it felt really important that it was in there. And what I really like about the fact that the new chapter has a central place in the Tribes book now, and more space and time has gone into talking about and explaining the really important concepts that are related to pre-therapy, whether that's looking at different types of contact. Because one of the things I feel is that fundamental to pre-therapy is the notion of psychological contact. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about that soon, and how Prouty sort of developed that concept, or working with the notion of working with people who may be contact impaired, or where psychological contact is missing, or a bit sort of like it zones in and out. And I think the other thing that I really liked about it is that it was very clear. So it feels like a really lovely introduction to pre-therapy and contact reflections to someone who may not have come across it before. And from my sense is that even though it's fundamental to me and fundamental to you, Anne-Marie, that I don't know how many counselling students, person-centered counselling students, are actually formally introduced to pre-therapy as a practice. So that's when my initial thoughts came from reading the chapter.
Yeah, and I really echo that, because it was one of the comments when I was doing my research and I was doing the reading, the literature, and just this well, the lack of connection, it seemed, in the literature around learning disabilities, and lack of understanding or lack of recognition of this option of pre-therapy and contact work, but also within the person-centered field, it felt like it just wasn't recognised, and there was bits of it, but it just didn't seem to be seen as a way of working. It just felt like a bit of an add-on. And I imagine it wasn't intentional, but I think because for me, I was very passionate about the fact that I see many people suffering with learning disabilities because their mental health isn't taken seriously, isn't understood, or there's a fear. So nothing happens, which kind of paralysis, really. So it was good to then see the chapter, and like you say, that it felt really clear. And it's difficult because I've spent so much time reading about it. Of course, it seems clear to me, but actually it did feel like there was an understanding and explanation of it all. And that sense of putting it in with the tribes. This isn't an add-on, this is really part of a way of working. And I guess some of the fundamentals around the person-centered approach, those 6 conditions and core conditions, and I know we're going to come on to that, but yeah, it was just great to see it. But I think the thing that stayed with me, or a couple of things that stayed with me most, was that being in contact is in and of itself therapeutic, and the questions that come up around what is the purpose of therapy, which again I think is one of the reasons why these client groups are often marginalized, is that you come with a problem, we work it through, and you have some tools to manage it, rather than understanding that where there is no contact, that in itself is causing that individual distress and potentially harm. So that being in contact is the way of enabling the person to feel more whole and seen and heard, and the value of that. And that comes from being in relationship with people with learning disabilities for whom contact was often missing, with self and with others. So it's great to see that. But I guess the other thing that really stayed with me was when I was doing my research, and although it was a small piece, there wasn't too many contributions. The thing that came up was that they needed more examples of how do you put it into practice, and a wider range of people that you would use pre-therapy and contact work with. And I feel like the chapter really gave that. And therefore, hopefully it's going to open up for more people. Like, oh, maybe I need to know more about this. So yeah, so I think that's kind of where I'm sort of starting from in terms of that. And I know we wanted to talk about psychological contact, and I wonder if now is the time, because that kind of feels like our foundation, feels like our bedrock on which these conversations are happening.
Yeah, and I think for me that when I was a student, when I was learning about psychological contact, and that sense that it's almost when Rogers first started to talk about psychological contact, it was almost like it was a given. Either psychological contact is there or it's not. And actually what I've realized through work is that there are degrees of psychological contact, and Dion Lander talks about grey zone functioning, where clients can move in and out of different qualities of psychological contact, and often as psychological contact alongside client perception of the therapist's conditions, and the therapist's empathy, congruence, and UPR, they themselves are marginalised. They bookend the therapist's conditions, so they're often not really considered. So when it comes back to the psychological contact side of things, it's about what do we do as therapists, as counsellors, if we sense that a client is out of contact? Is that fleeting, or is that something about their functioning? And as you said before, do we assume that clients with particular presentations are unable to gain that psychological contact, so therefore they can't engage in therapy? Whereas for me, there's a sense of a responsibility as a therapist to work on connection with a client.
And I think it comes down to, for me, that thing of, that thing was a given. Either you're in contact or you're not. And then that opening out of actually the degrees of that. But also for me, that thing of, well, because somebody isn't doesn't mean they can't. And I think that's the point of pre-therapy and contact work, is what it says is, okay, so they're not. So how do we enable? How do we facilitate that? How do we establish and maintain that? And in that session, it might come and go, so it might be fluctuating. So I think there's something about understanding, well, what is psychological contact? When it's absent, what can be done to establish it? Because it's not that it can never happen, it's that it's not there easy, it's not readily available to an individual, because maybe brain function, a learning disability, or trauma, there's so many things where that can be very difficult to access. And then when you do establish that, how that might fluctuate, either with somebody for whom it is largely impaired or frequently impaired, or the person in front of us who is recalling or talking about things that are particularly difficult for them, and therefore they're disappearing, as it were, or dissociating. And then so really that need to, because I think pre-therapy and contact work, it feels like it's been a bit of a specialization, as if it's only with certain people. And I think what we're trying to do is say, well, hang on, we've got to go back to contact. And actually, any one of us can wander off. And most of us will come back. But actually, sometimes we might need help, both to contact with ourselves and the other, and how to look after ourselves in that.
And also there's that third element of contact, the contact with the world, to contact with the environment that you're in. So you mentioned sort of like that contact with self. So somebody might be dissociating, or they might have a fragmented sense of self because of their life experiences. It might be it's that interpersonal contact with other people that's impaired, but it might also be around that, when people talk about derealization or depersonalization, that lack of contact with the world, with the situation, and any of those can impact on psychological contact with in a therapeutic sense.
Yeah. And I think then that's the thing is, and then going back, that sense of, so there are many, because I've lived and worked with many people with disabilities who just seem quite lost. And there's somebody there, there's a person there, and you'll have moments. But actually, whether it's in the care setting, and this is where contact work comes into it, rather than sort of pre-therapy as such, and both use contact reflections, but also where somebody's clearly distressed, as you say, presenting with clear distress, whether it's self-harm, whether it's harm to others, whether it's complete withdrawal, depression, whatever is going on, is that it's not okay to just say, well, that's how they are. And I think this is where my frustration comes, is that actually it is not good enough. It's not good enough for any human being to be told or said, well, that's just how they are. Because actually, with time, with patience, with the right tools, for want of a better word, things can be different. And we don't know how they can be different, but it's not to give up on those people. And here's a way where we can do that.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that is really important about pre-therapy and those contact reflections is that it's all about reflecting the concrete reality of the client in one given moment. So it's not around like offering a reflection or an interpretation. It's around their reality now.
Yeah.
To enable them to either regain contact with themselves and the world that they're in, or with the person that they're with. It feels really simplistic to do, but actually it takes a lot of hard work and effort to stay in the concrete, because and I think particularly if you're used to working with people who have psychological contact, where it's not fleeting, that it's a really hard concept to grapple with, because you're used to working with people where there is psychological contact. But as you mentioned, that we all lose contact now and again, whether that is like getting distracted by staring out the window at something that's happening and daydreaming, or whether it is around dissociation, or whether or not it's more to do with a different type of processing style or a learning disability. So how do we introduce and think about pre-therapy and contact reflections in a way that isn't, should say, feels like it isn't specialized and it's out there, but it's something that we can all, as therapists, it's something that is fundamental about connection.
Yeah. And I think that comes back to this question around, again, so myself and Leslie are working with another group, which we've now called ourselves Therapy Fit for All, but exploring, how do we work with and share resources, but working with people who have learned disabilities, people with autism, and other neurodivergent, but particularly autism. But those groups of people who are non-verbal or have less cognition, or generally just kind of went, oh, well, it doesn't work for them, and they're almost feels like they can be written off. So I think there's something about really wanting to explore and open out. And it's not that I'm suggesting everybody will want to and feel able to work with people with disabilities, but that it's not assumed that they can't, because actually contact can be lost at any moment. And how do we manage that? And I think the other thing I was just sort of, when we were talking before, and yesterday I was at a task seminar run by online events with Sally Polovitz, whose name I hope I haven't said incorrectly, and I'm probably misremembering the quote, but it really struck with me. And it was, when injustice becomes law, then resistance is our duty. And I think for me, it does feel like that. It does feel like there is a lot of social injustice around people who are accessing social and health care, in that, and I don't just mean funding, but just there's a lack of understanding of, all we have a responsibility to support those who can't necessarily do that. And as therapists, I believe that we have a responsibility to be aware of how you might work with that group. And that's where fundamental comes back to that thing around contact, so that we understand. And I think we've chatted at different times, and something you were saying before we started this, that sense of, and it was something that definitely came up in my own research, was how difficult it is to define what psychological contact is. And almost I wonder if that's why we don't sort of look at it too much. I mean, some do, but it still feels like it's on the periphery, like say the bookends of the core conditions, which are about our role as therapists. But actually in this case, we have to intervene, we have to initiate. We're not waiting and following. We're still following, we're still waiting, but we're naming what we're in, so that the waiting and the following is for them to be able to make contact and then take the lead. But actually what we're saying is, in order to be able to follow the lead of an individual, we need to be in contact. So therefore we need to find ways to do that, and actually naming the space, using those contact reflections and seeing what's there, naming what's there and only what's there, does enable people who often aren't seen, and often, nothing against care settings, I still support in that field, but quite often you're so busy you don't see. Or you see the task, but you don't always get time to see the person and to keep that relationship. And so how important it is that, whether it's contact work in the care setting or contact reflections in pre-therapy, that we're finding ways to meet.
What just struck me as we're talking about this, we're very familiar with contact reflections.
Yes.
But I'm wondering that maybe not everybody will have read the chapter or know what the different contact reflections are. So it might be worth going through. So there's five contact reflections. So one is situational reflections, where you are commenting on the physical environment that you and the client are in.
Yeah, the shared space.
The shared space, yeah.
And in a sense, naming it as a shared space, it's kind of a reaching out. It's an invitation to say, you're naming it, but you're reaching out saying, I'm here too, can I come in? That's how I see it. Yeah.
Yeah, and we can talk about later on about the development that we made to help the students at John Moores, which includes a situational reflection. So then there is the verbal reflection. So a verbal reflection would be that you would repeat back the words of the client, or maybe the sounds that the client has made if they are non-speaking. And then what you've got is something called a facial reflection. So you either would reflect on a client's facial expression, or you might physically reflect the client's facial expression.
So mirroring it almost, naming and mirroring it. Yeah.
And then what we have is bodily reflections. So that might be you are commenting on the client's behavior. You stand up, you walk to the window. Again, like facial expressions, the facial reflections, the bodily reflections can also be a physical mirroring of the client's reflections. And then the final one is reiterative reflections. So you might say you stood up and walked to the window and then said. And when I talked about verbal reflection before, the actual accurate title is word for word reflections.
And they seem, like you said, they seem really simple, and it's something in all the literature says, it seems very simple, but it's not easy to do, and I think that's the problem, is that quite often, because it's so simplistic, we think that it's not enough. When actually, if we're totally disconnected from self or other environment, the thing we need is to be enabled to. And people may not be ready at that point. This is why, that's, I think, the other thing that can put people off is that it can take weeks, months for somebody to do that. You might be spending 15, 20 minutes, because it won't be a standard session, or standard length of session every week, same time, every week, same space. And you might be doing that for weeks, months, before the person finally acknowledges you. I think that's where it can be difficult, that sense of, well, we kind of want instant results, or we want some sort of feedback. And recognizing that actually for this person, they can't necessarily give us that immediately, but are continuing to stay faithful, to stay with, is part of that making contact. It is part of that building relationship, which is, I would say, therapeutic, because we're choosing to stay with.
Absolutely. And not only that, it is deeply respectful and deeply empathic with the client who's in front of us, because we're not trying to do something to them, we're being with. And I think that sense that you mentioned, that being with and alongside is fundamental in all of that. And
I was just thinking as well of Marley's partner's work, and she writes a lot about using contact reflections in a contact work setting. So not just therapeutically, but in a setting, which is really important. It's kind of how you work with. So it's not just what happens in this one-to-one space, but that this becomes the norm. But one of the things that she said, and it really stayed with me when I was doing the reading, when I was doing the research, it was actually understanding, using contact reflections can help you have a much deeper lived experience, phenomenological, I guess, understanding of the core conditions. Because to keep staying with, I'm not trying to push or pull or nudge or manipulate, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but without trying to do that, being there alongside every week is UPR, is unconditional positive regard, but also that reflecting what's happening around. That empathy, the as if, is I'm asking, can I be alongside you? Really seek. And I think in some respects, it can be a really, just thinking about it now, can also be a really useful way to understand power dynamics. Because it's not about me trying to, well, do this or try that, or you're doing, shall we do, it's really staying with. And my experience of doing that in a care setting, I've not done it formally therapeutically yet, but is that, and I always get emotional when I talk about it, that is just so opening for me as a person, to when those moments come, when somebody does open, knowing how long and how difficult it's been for that person to get to that point. It's such a powerful emotion, but the power dynamics, I think, can be key in that.
Yeah, and what came up for me when you started to talk about that is the trusting in the client's actualizing tendency. Which to me is almost like the fundamental bit about person-centered practice, that and the actualizing tendency there, and however long it takes, that effort to be able to be in touch with the client.
Yeah. And I guess coming back to what you're saying before about the first and sixth conditions there, the establishing or reaching out to make contact, but being respectful of that. And the moment when there is a response and you get that moment where they look, when somebody looks at you and they see that you have heard and seen them. It's, yeah. And I think sometimes we don't always acknowledge that, even when we're doing talking therapy, even when we're with people who are verbal and are in contact, I don't think we always recognise the importance of how is this being received. Or maybe that's just my thinking about it, but I think sometimes the training is all on the core conditions, but in focusing on the core conditions, and I guess I'm wondering why we're still calling them core, is that actually we need to be looking at the whole, it's environmental, but the environmental stuff means nothing if we aren't checking in how it's being received and understood.
Yeah.
And what impact it's having, what's it leading to.
Yeah, because fundamentally the client's perception is fundamental in all of this.
Yeah.
That not only is psychological contact really important for psychological change to happen,
yeah,
but actually the client's perception of the therapist's conditions is key. That if a client perceives that you are with them, that in of itself is therapeutic, which goes back to our initial sort of like ponderings about what is and isn't therapy and therapeutic.
And if somebody feels like they're being seen and heard, they're more likely to start, the word that comes to mind, risking being themselves or becoming themselves, which, going back to the person-centered approach, is that sort of theory of personality change. And, you do that because you connect to parts of yourself that maybe you've denied or have been hidden or have been pushed away or have dominated, and it's kind of becoming more whole as a person. And we can do that when we feel safe enough to start taking those risks. And so essentially that's what we're saying pre-therapy and contact reflections and contact work can do, is enable somebody or facilitate somebody feeling safe enough to start becoming themselves. And that's an ongoing journey. And I think because, particularly thinking now about people with learning disabilities in the care setting, because quite often staff turnover is frequent, that's lost. So no wonder so many of these people are often withdrawal or go into lose psychological contact, because actually there isn't a mainstay, there isn't that person or those people, or often, and not all the time, it's very different to, I know, 40, 50 years ago, but still for a lot of people, there isn't that sort of core group of people who are alongside you that I know for myself I depend on. And thank you very much to them. But it's that sort of, and it's a mutual as well. So I'm just really conscious of the ramifications of enabling and looking at psychological contact with everyone, really questioning what we mean by that.
Absolutely.
So I guess just following on from what we've sort of been saying about, for us, the centrality, the fundamentality of psychological contact, and I guess what we're kind of saying is, or what I'm hearing, and I definitely heard it when I was doing my research, was it seems really hard to be able to define psychological contact. And when I was doing my research, that was one of the things that came up as one of my questions, what is psychological contact? What do you understand by it? And there was lots of and pauses and people not quite knowing how to say it. And that realization that actually on the course, we hadn't, I mean, I was a couple of years behind or ahead, but that we hadn't really talked about what do we mean by it? What is it? And a need then to look at, well, if people don't understand what it is, how is that affecting their willingness, their openness to explore pre-therapy contact work, contact reflections rather? Because not just syndrome, because in the research that people would definitely, yeah, we'd like to know more, but we want to know a bit more about what it is, how you do it. Needed a few more examples, and I think this is where the chapter in the tribes is great, because it shows, it gives more examples and different ways of working with people, which I think is just so important. And I would say that there needs to be sort of visual, sort of video case studies. Now, how do you demonstrate it in action? Because it is so simple and yet not. And I guess that takes us then to the work that we started doing.
Yes.
As a result. So, you know, with my research, what came up was people were open to it, but they needed a different footing. They needed a different way into it. And maybe you can say a bit more. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that came across for me, obviously, because I'm quite passionate about pre-therapy and contact work, and actually I having worked with people with learning disabilities and autistic clients and neurodivergent clients, and clients who, you know, on occasion in sessions will, where they'll be out of contact, and I've actually, you know, used contact reflections as a way of re-engaging psychological contact. It, to me, it makes complete and utter sense. But what we realized, mainly because of your reflections, but also the reflections of a fellow student of yours, Maddie Hall, that not all students got it, because it was so concrete and literal and not moving beyond the actual moment by moment reality of a client. It was a really difficult concept to grasp. So we were trying to make sense of, well, how do we change the way that pre-therapy is spoken about as taught on the course? Because we have one session, so it is only an introduction nonetheless, but there's lots of pre-reading around it, and but how do we make it more real so that people actually get it? And so, following on from your research, or your master's dissertation, we came up with an idea of developing a video that would demonstrate the variety of different contact reflections, so word for word, situational, facial, bodily, reiterative. And so it was actually going to be co-developed by myself and students. So yourself and Maddie. So do you want to take it a bit further now about the video itself?
Yeah, so I guess we were kind of trying to work out what would be a scenario, and it was very short clip. It was only a couple of minutes in the end, but myself and Maddie sort of played those roles. It was role play, and I guess the thing was, when we had the lecture and we did role plays, or we kind of did works in groups, for a lot of people, because they didn't know what to expect, it just seemed incomprehensible. It was just too difficult to go into. Whereas, because myself and Maddie were more comfortable with pre-therapy contact reflections, we were able to do something. So I took the role as a client, and Maddie was a therapist, and effectively she followed me, and as much as she stayed with me, she kind of named things that were happening, didn't push or pull, but then essentially what we demonstrated, or tried to demonstrate, was that over time, and obviously it was a shortened, you know, we did in a few minutes what you might do over several sessions and several months even, but that because the therapist didn't push me, the therapist named what was there, was saying, this is, I'm here, and it felt like an invitation, that eventually I felt able to allow myself to be seen and to be heard. But essentially then what happened is we did a few minutes where we demonstrated each of the different contact reflections, and that was recorded, videoed, and then that was then put on a piece of tech from the university, the department, to enable it to be used as a way of demonstrating and asking students to say, what do you think has just been demonstrated? What was presented there? Which of the contact reflections did you see there? And it was, you know, so it was an introduction, and then this was shown, and then people were asked to say, which one do you think it is? And if they were correct, great. If they weren't, try again, sort of thing. But it meant that they had time to stop and look at it and wonder and think and process through. But actually to see two people who were comfortable doing it rather than with people who were struggling, I would say, with the idea and the concreteness of it, as you say.
Yeah. And having been able to access that in addition to the lecture has really increased students' like confidence in being able to utilize contact reflections. And I think the other sense is that alongside that it is more of the emphasis on psychological contact, on what it is, to enable a more nuanced understanding, so that it's not marginalized, that it's pivotal to pre-therapy work, but also all work as person-centered counselors. And the thing about although pre-therapy is a development of person-centered approach, it's actually trans-theoretical. So it's that contact is fundamental across all client groups and all theory. It can be applied to anybody. And I think that in a way the universality of contact reflections shows the importance of it in terms of being in contact with whoever, whether that's in a therapeutic setting or in everyday life.
Yeah, because essentially if you're, you know, sort of speaking with some colleagues who are not person-centered but are working with learning disabilities, is that the first thing you're doing is connecting. And contact, psychological contact, is about connection. And in order to then use art therapy or creative arts or sound or plasticine or music or dance or instruments, you have to be in, there has to be a connection on which those tools, those means, that modality can be used. Which then enables a relationship to develop. And then because there's a relationship, then things can deepen. And so, yeah, I think that's really important. So while it's come from the person-centered perspective, initially, it is actually something that all therapy involves. You know, if you don't have contact, nothing's going to happen. It's just two people in a room or in a space or...
And in a way, thinking about where contact reflections come in relation to maybe grounding techniques or elements of that often, you know, people might use grounding techniques as part of their therapeutic practice, but actually sometimes those grounding techniques are ineffective because the contact isn't there. Almost like that people are moving through too many steps. And it can never be assumed. And the thing about contact reflections, from my experience, is that you might sense that somebody is out of contact and you might offer a contact reflection, but given their response to that, you will immediately know whether or not there's contact there or not. So you can move from person-centered reflections into contact reflections and back almost like seamlessly. And I guess for me, it's something that is so integral to my practice anyway. I just do it. I forget that that's what I'm doing. I'm moving from one to another, but it might feel quite artificial and awkward for some, especially when they may be newly qualified or actually trainee therapists. And then that comes back to, is this something that is being taught to on counselling and psychotherapy courses? Is pre-therapy and contact work something that is being introduced? If not, why not? And if it is, how is it being introduced? And is it, can it evolve? Can we improve the way that we teach these concepts to counselling students?
And I think alongside that is two things. One is, and I'm thinking about one of the contributors to the research, really was focusing on, this isn't just about learning disabilities or autism. This is about people who are dealing with trauma.
Yeah.
And so sometimes grounding will help, but actually sometimes if the person is completely separated out, as it were, then actually it's where contact reflections come into it. So then there's a need for that where contact is there and it's obvious, but it disappears, that fluctuating. But also for the person for whom it has to be established, there's still a need to be aware of the physical presence that's in front of you and that support. But also, and I've kind of lost my train of thought there, and this is what often happens to me because so much in this kind of goes. But I think it's something about if we don't teach this, if we aren't taught this, if we aren't exploring what this means, there are a whole group of people in our society who will just get further and further marginalised, will live in places of distress and emotional and psychological distress, when there are ways, very easy ways, and it's a culture. And I think this is something Jan van Verde speaks a lot, and has got lots of experience in this, that contact milieu, that space. It's about creating a culture. It's about saying this is the way we can interact with one another. This is the way that we relate to one another, because this benefits everyone. It benefits the individual. My experience is it benefited me because I think it taught me a lot about myself and opened me out. But also as the support worker or the carer or the family member, life does get better because actually there's a way of relating to somebody where behaviours that are communicating distress, they're understood. So actually then you can start looking at the distress, you can start alleviating. And I'm not saying it makes it perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but in many cases it makes life much easier for the individual, which therefore means that those around them, which means that you can start building more deeper relationships of reciprocity rather than carer power dynamic, the individual being cared for. And to me, that's what it means to be human. That's what for me, that's what part of what therapy is for, is about enabling each of us to become the whole human we can be in any given moment. And sometimes that's somebody's really struggling, and other times that's where somebody is flourishing, So it's kind of, how do we create that space? And even if people, even if lots of potential therapists aren't necessarily planning to work with that group, that it's not assumed that they can't. That there'll always be that window if something happens, they're not going to kind of go, well, I can't deal with this. Because also, what does that say for the individual in front? It's another example of being rejected because of who I am, when actually there's nothing wrong with the individual. It's about the culture, it's about the environment, or what we can do to support and enable that person to become whatever it is they can become in that moment. And I realise I'm getting a bit sort of philosophical in this, but for me it is a philosophy. In fact, Prout himself very much roots in a philosophical sort of space as well. But yeah, so I think there's a real need to almost kind of across all courses, that question of, are you facilitating, introducing, opening up conversations about working with people where contact will either need to be established and maintained throughout, or where it will fluctuate. And while it's based in the person-centered approach, this is about all people in all contexts, which I think is really important. And I get a sense that's not necessarily where some people in the person-centered field would be okay with that, but for me, this is about the people, and these are people who need to be heard and seen and supported.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think as an educator, as somebody who teaches about pre-therapy and contact work, it feels having a responsibility to be able to share that, to be able to increase awareness. It's really quite fundamental, and that's why it's part of our program. That I cannot ever envisage the course running without a session on contact work and pre-therapy, because to me it is so fundamental to everything.
And I guess alongside that is how do we, or how is psychological contact then taught? Before you even go on to pre-therapy and how you establish and maintain it, is how do we talk about it? How is it described? How is it explained? Going back to the person-centered context, you know, and, you know, I think I mentioned before, but, you know, again, Marley's partner's work, that actually in establishing contact, you have to really live those core conditions. And you'll know if those are being lived when you see the response, how it's received.
Yes.
So how you see it as a whole thing, you know, bookends, but without the bookends, there's no structure. The book will fall apart. The pages have got nothing to be bound to. So how is this held? I like my metaphors.
I like your metaphors too. And I think it almost feels like that's a really good place to end. So we started off talking about how the development of the new chapter in the third edition of the Tribes, and how that in itself has evolved so that it does feel as if pre-therapy has a more central role. And of course, it's not only in the new Tribes book, there's a chapter on it in the newer edition of the Handbook of Person-Centered Psychotherapies and Counselling as well. Which for 2024, it feels like actually now is the time to embrace pre-therapy and contact reflections. And it's been a really great opportunity to talk to you about it, Anne-Marie, because you know that when we two get together and talk about it, we're both very passionate about the subject.
Yeah, and I think it's also just that opportunity to talk about it, but also to offer that conversation and to wonder who else is wondering about, who else already is using it, or who is working with clients where actually they need to know about this or need to know more about it. So it's kind of hopefully, you know, we're not here as experts by any stretch of the imagination, but as people who are interested and who want to develop that. And, you know, that goes back to the work that we're doing with another group, specifically around learning disabilities and people with autism, around, you know, what resources are out there and how do we share that, and how do we keep doing that? How do we network and open that out so that people who are often already on the margins are not further marginalised, and hopefully change in some way can happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you for those who have tuned in. And hopefully if nothing else, it's raised questions. You know, we're not suggesting you necessarily agree with us, but that hopefully it's raised some questions and some thoughts, and yeah, we'll see what comes out of that. You know, it's, we definitely will still be looking at this going forward. So yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks
thank you,
very
everybody.
much. Thank you. Bye.